Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Akbari, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third webinar in the Ethiopian Studies series hosted by the Institute for Advanced Study. This series is co-convened by Aaron Butts, Samantha Kelly, Sabina Schmidtke, and myself. Our first webinar on the Beta Israel and Ethiopian Christian views of Jews and Judaism took place on the 17th of November and was very successful. Recordings of those talks can be found on the IAS webpage for this series. And on the 17th of February, we held the first of two webinars on the topic, The Turn to the Medieval in Ethiopian Studies, The Turn to Ethiopia in Medieval Studies. Recordings by those speakers, Andrea Achi, Marie-Laure Dera, Kristen Windmiller-Luna, and Felix Salam Yerga can also be found on the IAS website. This is, as I said, the second in a pair of webinars on the intersection of Ethiopian studies and medieval studies. Introducing today's event is Aaron Butts. He is Associate Professor of Semitic and Egyptian Languages and Literatures at the Catholic University of America. Last year, Aaron was a member in the School of Historical Studies at IAS, and this year he is in residence, at least virtually so far, at the Hiob Ludolf Center for Ethiopian Studies in Hamburg, supported by a Humboldt Research Fellowship for Experienced Researchers. Before turning things over to Aaron, let me conclude my welcome with some housekeeping remarks. Please note that this session, like the previous ones, will be recorded. We'll have time for questions at the end, but please put your questions in the chat. You can do this at any time, including during the talks. So in the chat, not the Q&A function, but the chat. Finally, let me encourage you to come to the final webinar in this year's series called Beyond Ethiopia, the Islamic Intellectual History of the Horn of Africa, which will take place on May 14th. Thank you again for coming, and let me turn things over to Aaron.
Thank you, Suzanne. And with thanks to my other co-organizers, Sabina Schmidtke and Samantha Kelly, welcome to today's webinar. Our subject today, as you know, is the intersection of medieval studies and Ethiopian studies, two fields with different regional concentrations and historical formations that nevertheless share many areas of inquiry and have points of contact or entanglement. Especially with the rise of the global Middle Ages as a rubric in which to examine contemporaneous developments on a broad geographical canvas, we are interested in interrogating the possibilities and the drawbacks of this intersection from multiple perspectives, from different disciplines, in terms of different applications, and in light of the orientations potentially brought by training in different contexts. This might be specifically Ethiopian or Byzantine African, Near Eastern, or Islamic. In the interest of not taking up too much time with introductions, let me just say a brief word about each of our four panelists and the order in which they will be speaking. Our first speaker will be Dr. Alessandro Bauzi, who is Professor of Ethiopian Studies at Universität Hamburg, where he is a member of the Cluster of Excellence Understanding Written Artifacts, and in addition directs several projects in Ethiopian Eritrean philology, manuscript studies, linguistics, and corpus linguistics at the Hiob Ludolf Center for Ethiopian and Eritrean Studies. This includes the DFG-supported project Beta Metzaheft, which I'm convinced will transform the field of Ethiopic studies in the years to come. In his own research, Dr. Bauzi has especially contributed on the earliest phase of ancient Ethiopic scribal and literary history, on epigraphy, on canonical and hagiographical liturgical collections, and generally on the textual criticism of Ethiopic texts and on the manuscript culture of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Our second speaker will be Dr. Verena Krebs, who is Professor for Medieval Cultural Realms and Their Entanglements at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum, Germany, where she also co-directs the Bochum Center for Mediterranean Studies. She obtained a binational PhD in history from the University of Constance, Germany, and Mekelle, Ethiopia in 2014. Her primary research focus is on the late medieval Solomonic Kingdom of Ethiopia and its connections to the wider Mediterranean region. Her first monograph, Medieval Ethiopian Kingship, Craft, and Diplomacy, will be published by Palgrave Macmillan next month. I highly encourage you to read it. It's fantastic. And she's in the process of completing a second monograph on medieval Ethiopian religious material culture, preliminarily entitled Africa Collecting Europe, Patronage, Religious Material Culture, and the Assertion of Local Power in Ethiopia, 1470 to 1530. Dr. Krebs will be followed by Eyob Darillo, who is curator for Ethiopic and Ethiopian collections in the Department of Asian and African Studies at the British Library. As many of you will know, he recently curated the splendid exhibition, African Scribes, Manuscript Culture of Ethiopia, which was the first exhibition to be held at the British Library devoted entirely to Ethiopian manuscripts. Eob Darillo holds a bachelor's degree in History of Art and Archaeology from SOAS, University of London, a Master's of Arts and Film Studies from Birkbeck, University of London, and is currently completing his doctorate at SOAS in the Department of Religions and Philosophies. His doctoral research focuses on the nature and historical development of the concept of Ethiopian magic and its use within a specifically Christian context. Our final speaker today will be Dr. Samantha Kelly, who is professor of history at Rutgers University. She specializes in the intersections of religion, politics, and culture in the later medieval Mediterranean. In addition to 2 books on the Kingdom of Naples, she has written on aspects of Ethiopian-European exchange and has edited the collection of essays, A Companion to Medieval Ethiopia and Eritrea. This is a fantastic resource if you've not just seen it. She's currently writing a monograph on the Ethiopian hostel monastery of Santo Stefano in Rome as a member of the Institute for Advanced Study. Unfortunately, Professor Kelly is unable to join us in person today, but we will benefit from her comments in a pre-recorded talk. In the interest of fostering discussion, each panelist will present briefly for say 10 to 15 minutes. The panelists will then have a few moments to ask each other questions or point to intersections in their own work, after which we'll open the floor for questions from attendees. If you have a question you would like to pose to a panelist, please write it in the chat, directed to everyone. You can see the chat symbol at the bottom of your screen. And if you want, indicate to which panelist the question is directed. My colleague Suzanne Akbari and I will moderate the chat, reading your questions and relaying them to the panelists.